It's 100-day project time again, and I am getting a late start, but I am getting a start. I started last year with tinting tissue paper for translucent collage paper, and I'm going to start with tinting tissue paper again this year, but with a new technique I recently learned about in a Skillshare class. Last year I started with my take on a technique I learned from Mary Beth Quinn, and this year I'm starting with my take on a technique I learned from Jane Davies, as mentioned in a Skillshare class. The first difference is using palette paper to paint the tissue paper on. She starts with it open, puts the tissue paper on it, then you can tear out the palette paper, set it aside to dry. I have cut down my palette paper so it will fit on this cooling rack as a drying rack. I have also cut my tissue paper to fit on the sheets of palette paper. As you can see, these are a little bit wrinkly, and that is fine. This is also just plain old, inexpensive gift wrap tissue paper. This is the kind with one side that's a little shiny. It's a little crispy. I like that kind the best. I found it doesn't really matter which side you paint on, especially with the lighter colors, as in the thinned out, more watery paint. Let's start out by setting up each sheet so it's ready to go. One difference in my technique for this video, and I am trying this out for the first time, by the way, Jane Davies uses golden fluid acrylics, and I think they would be ideal, but I do not have any, so I will be using my typical Liquitex basic tubes. Golden fluid acrylics are on my list of things to try, add to my collection of art supplies. In fact, they were on my list during the recent Blick sale, but with everything else going on, I never did place an order. I did use my favorite scissors that I recommend. You will be able to find a link to the week's supplies in the description of each video. Here's a little bit more of a look at the baking rack I'm talking about. So it is a layered, stacked rack that collapses for easy storage. The second difference in the way I will be doing my version of this type of tissue paper tinting is I will be using a gel plate as my paint palette. So I will end up with at least one more sheet of interesting collage paper. I will also be using one of my favorite tissue paper tinting paintbrushes, my Simply Simmons extra large number 50 filbert brush, but also a smaller flat brush similar to what was used in the Skillshare class. I also have my spray bottle of water as well as a container of clean water to experiment with both a way more similar to how Jane does it and more like I'm used to, similarly to how Mary Beth Quinn does. I will be using limited color palette of quinacridone magenta, cadmium yellow medium hue, Prussian blue, which as the phthalo blue I predominantly used last year. A little bit goes a long way. I will again be using Payne's Gray as my black, and I don't use white on my tissue paper because it makes it more opaque and the point is translucent. So instead of mixing a significant amount of paint in a container with water, I will just be doing blending on my palette. Now my goal was to first work in the light tones because we do want a range of value from light to mid to dark. So this is a drawback. Well, to be honest, part of it is the issue of my paintbrush. I usually use this for applying adhesive, which is usually a matte or gloss medium. It has been cleaned, but it is also rigid, part of the bristles. Oh my goodness. So for our lightest tones, we want the most amount of water. Which, to be honest, isn't going very well. I think part of the problem is not being able to get enough water in my brush. I'm also concerned that the other brush I found, in case this was a problem, well, that also helps. But this surface, the tissue paper rips rather easily, so less amount of working the paper, the better. Does create some nice texture. Because I am getting a better hook on this technique will be good. And having a narrower brush, it's also quite soft, would also be an improvement. And although my goal was using more water to get some light tones, I mostly have mid-tones here, some light here. And despite that, I have an awful lot of water because I've picked up quite a lot of pigment compared to the amount of water I had. We can slide this over to dry. All right, this feels like it would be just so little of the paper to work with at a time, but that will also allow for more variety. So doing the paper this way could allow for a lot more variation. Variation in tone. There, I think that's more how my paint to water ratio should be for my lightest tones. As I said, this is my first time trying this technique. I should say, so you get to see it live, but well, it's close to live as anyone is going to see it. Whoops. So with the amount of water I am putting on, I'm not using my spray bottle at this moment. I will probably at some point. Get some more water down here. I seem to have a lot of paint in my brush. So right now I'm going for the magenta to yellow to orange. This creates a lovely orange. That is very common in my translucent layer collages. One thing that, yes, another big difference between what I am doing and what Jane was doing in the video is she was working with earth tones and neutrals, and it was gorgeous. But I'm sticking with a brighter color palette for different use. So this is getting some good light tones, some mid tones. Let's put on it a little thicker here. Oops. That'll be some deeper tones. Oops, that's a little too globby there. With this sort of plum at the bottom, I did add some of the phthalo or Payne's Gray. So one drawback of using Payne's Gray is the black is it is a very blue tone. So, as you noticed with the orange, it was slightly muddy, but I liked it. But you would have to be cautious mixing your orange and your blue and your orange and your Payne's Gray. And, well, that was not my best idea to try to shift the tissue paper after it was wet. This is getting too red for my taste. I have a tendency not to like to work with red because I never managed to do a good job at it. It always ends up looking like a bloodbath to me. So let's... I'm not doing an ideal job of getting all of my tones as far as light, mid, dark. At least not yet. Speeding things up more than a bit while I wasn't talking. Ooh, I do like that plum down in the corner there. Mixing a lot of colors on this page. So I intended to keep pages like blue and purple, blues and greens, reds, yellows, oranges. But this is interesting. Ooh, I'm gonna... That's a cool effect. Maybe not ideal for some projects, but that'll be a fun piece of paper to have. You may not be surprised, since I told you that Payne's Gray leans to blue, that the yellow and the Payne's Gray make an interesting green. But it's true for any black. You can create such interesting, earthy, swampy, if that's what you're going for, greens by mixing yellows and blacks. The sheets need to be totally dry before you pull them from the palette paper. And the palette paper really does work great for tinting tissue paper and giving it a nice surface to work on that allows some texture and color blending and won't stick. So this technique, the way I ended up doing it, ended up quite a lot like my original form of tinting tissue paper, but way less messy. It's more difficult to do a large number of papers, I would say, because with the larger technique, I can hang them to dry on the wooden drying racks I have. This would be a technique that would be far easier to do in person workshops, however. And if you have limited space, it's definitely easier. I did notice on the peeling up that this did get some of the shiny effect on the back that I wasn't expecting, but have had when working on large pieces of paper with acrylic inks on plastic tablecloths and plastic report covers. All in all, I really like how these papers turned out. A great start for my 100-day project this year, even if it was a late start. This experiment is definitely a keeper. Let me know what you think. There is more of the shiny on the back of this one. Pretty cool. I really like the variations of green in this with the mixing of the blue and the yellow and the Payne's Gray. And check out that translucence. I love it. That's why I love working with tissue paper. This tissue paper definitely looks different than any I have done before. I would love to hear in the comments if you have a favorite among today's tissue paper experiment that kicks off my 100-day project for this year. I am excited to be back, even if I am a little behind. As I said, one of my other differences is using one of my gel plates as my palette. This allows me to not waste any paint. This paint, however, was very, very wet, so I could have let that dry and pulled it up with another layer of paint, but I decided to see how it went. Honestly, I did not like how that paper came out while it was still wet. That changed after it was dry. Here I am creating some interesting texture with my brush, and I've decided to let that dry. So I'm kind of doing another project today, but I won't count these particular wet ones. I did, however, allow the speckled ones to dry overnight. And they became, with some bronze paint and matte medium, my mixed media 100-day project, day number 2. Thanks for joining me for my return to the 100-day project and 100 days of mixed media fun. Be sure to like and subscribe, and check the description for the materials used this week.